Hello guys, welcome. Today we'll be treating how to actually Dockerize a Laravel 11 application. And for us to actually Dockerize a Laravel 11 application, we know that it is going to require some other things that we probably do not have. And to explain, the purpose of Docker is to allow you to run applications on your system without necessarily installing the necessary dependencies in your system itself. So it also allows the sharing of code easy in teams. So let's say, for example, maybe in your own application, you have Laravel 8. You have PHP 7.4 installed in your system, and you have an application that you are working with consequently from time to time. You will not want to actually, you now need to run a Laravel application that is probably Laravel 11, and you can see the minimum requirement for Laravel 11 is it must be PHP 8.2. Although I know you can install multiple PHP version in your system, but you and I know that it is a pain in the ass when we are actually trying to do this stuff. So I am going to teach you step by step how to actually Dockerize your Laravel application. And during the process of Dockerizing the application, we are going to have different or everything that you may likely need to actually build a Laravel app installed. We are going to have the web server engines. We are going to have a database. We are going to even have a mail server that we can actually use to actually send out mail and receive mail within the application. Then we're also going to install PHPMyAdmin that we'll be able to use to actually access the database we have actually created. So I'm just going to start. So the first thing we need to do in order to actually create a Dockerized Laravel application is you need to actually create a Docker file. The Docker file will be like the base of where we are going to start our configuration from. So as we know, we need PHP 8.2 and above. So for this, I will be installing PHP 8.3 from the PHP Docker hub itself. So that is what I will be doing for this tutorial. So to start with, all we need to do is from the PHP, and this to know how to actually pull PHP version from Docker hub.docker/php. There are different forms of PHP that you can actually pull. There is you use the PHP command with these two dots, the version. Then you can pull the Apache version, or you can pull the Appline version, or you can put the CLI version if you just want to use it for CLI, or you can pull the FPM version. For this tutorial, I'll be making use of FPM because I'm a big fan of FPM, and I'll be using 8.3 8.3 with the FPM version. So that's the first thing. So we have pulled the PHP image like that from Docker hub. That's how you pull from PHP from Docker hub. Then I'll be creating two arguments. The first argument will be the user argument. The second argument will be the ID of the user itself. In your Linux application, I don't know about Windows, Linux, Ubuntu, every user has an ID and they also have a username, right? So that is what we are trying to do is we want to create a user that can be used within our Docker. I don't want root to be the user we are going to be using in our Docker. So that is why I'm actually going to be creating a user during the process of this application, of this Docker build. So the next thing we need to do is we need to install some dependencies, and dependencies are basically things like git, call, everything that you can think of that you actually use during the process of developing a Laravel application. So I already have that written somewhere, so I'm just going to copy it. So what this block basically does for us is it updates the first part here, updates the system package list. And this, just like if you are familiar with Linux command, this is how you actually install dependencies in your Linux on your Linux system. So these are it. So this way we'll be able to make use of git in the container, we'll be able to make use of call in the container. Then all of these packages have their own use. Then this zip, for example, you can use it to zip and unzip inside your container. Now, the next thing we are going to do now is we need to actually clean up the package manager, which is the next code that I am going to copy. So what this does is it cleans the package manager and goes ahead to remove all the packages that we've installed that are not needed. So maybe initially when you built your package, you used this MB, then later you realize you don't need it anymore, then it will remove it, because for every package you actually installed in your Docker application, it increases the size of your Docker app, or of your Docker container. So that is why we are actually, although it is not necessary, it is optional. Let me just state this there. It is optional. You don't have to do it. If you don't do it, you are still fine. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually install some PHP extensions, right? In order to install a PHP extension, if we go back to the PHP hub documentation, and let's see, how do we install PHP extensions? So as you can see, we need to run, um, I'm looking for it. Okay, this one is PCL extension. So in order to install core PHP extension, this is what you need to run: docker PHP extension install whatever extension that you actually want to install. As you can see, this is basically what we've done here, right? By running apt-get, blah, 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 updates and the likes. So what the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run that PHP. I'm going to copy the code to actually run that inside our Docker file. So I'm going to copy that. So the PDO, you might be wondering, okay, what is the purpose of all this extension that this man is installing? The PDO extension is for MySQL database support. This is what you are going to, because Laravel actually needs it. It's part of the extensions that is needed by Laravel to be able to connect to the database, to be able to actually run SQL query in your application. The MB string is also needed because it is used for manipulating strings and the likes and the likes. All of these extensions are needed. This, for example, now is used for image processing. You don't necessarily need to install everything, but for safety, I just install them when I actually am running a Laravel application. The next thing we need is, in order for you to run a PHP application that has dependencies, maybe like Composer and the likes, you need Composer in the system. And for that, we are going to go to the Composer image. And all you need to do for that is, in order to install Composer inside this your Docker container, all you need to do is copy this line and paste right here. So all we are doing right here is installing Composer. So what this does is it goes to the Composer Docker hub and pulls it from this URL into this URL inside our container. So this is inside our container. This is from the Docker up, the file that is put from Docker up itself. But for me, I'll be pulling the latest composer. Basically, that is what I'm doing here. So that's how you get composer into your application. Okay, now that we've actually pulled composer from the Docker up, the next thing I would like to do is to add the user that we passed from here to www data group. And let's see, what do we call the www data group? Www data group. Let's see. So which routes we compromise? Okay, so that's how we name it. So to add the user to the www data group, all we need to do is run user add the user ID, UID that we are passing. Do not forget that we are passing a UID in our Docker Compose file. The UID we are passing, then this flag M, we actually state that a directory should be created for that user, and the S, we state that the shell that we actually want to use for this particular user is bin slash bash slash bin slash bash, sorry, slash bin slash bash. So that's what we want. It is bin that we actually want to use for that user. The next thing we need is the group that we actually want to add the user to. The group we want to add the user to, that will be, the group will be www data, and the user that we actually wanted to add to the group. Now, this way, we've added the user to www data group. So that means we'll conveniently be able to run commands within our application using the user group without having any permission issue. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and change the ownership of the I'm going to copy all the files in the current directory to /var/ww inside our container, and I'm also going to change the ownership of all the files in the current directory like this. Change ownership to the ownership, we'll be changing it to the user we are passing, and also the www.data user. So they both own the file, then all the files that are in var/ww. So the next thing is we need to set the current user. So any command that is run will be run by the user that is actually passed. And we need to expose the port 9000. Then after exposing the ports, we need to use cmd. We need to run the php fpm. Now, this port 9000 will be used in the Nginx configuration, which we'll be seeing later during the course of the application. So let me create the Docker Compose file. Touch docker-compose.yml. Now, the docker-compose.yml is what will contain the majority of the things that we'll be using in our application. So now, the first thing you need to actually define when you are using Docker Compose is the version of the Docker Compose you are using. So for now, I'm going to be using Docker version. Now, there are different things that we need to define when working with Dockerfile. There is a tag called services. Services are basically the dependencies we need. I mean, when I say services, we need a web server, we need a DB, we need PHPMyAdmin. All of those components are going to be under services. Then we also need something called volumes. So let me just pause on that for now so that we will know the purpose of that later on. So in order to build our Dockerfile, we are going to create a service called app. So I'm just going to call it Laravel 11 app. That's what I'm going to call it. 11. Let me spell that very well. 11. Right. Laravel 11. That will be the name of this app that we are actually building. We'll see the purpose of that. So in order to build it, in order to build the Docker file, you pass a build. Then remember, we actually defined some arguments that I told you that we were going to pass into this Docker file. So the first thing we need to pass is the arguments. And the argument we are passing is the user that we want to pass, which is, I'll call it Laravel 11 user. And the UID of that user will be 1000, right? Now, to build your file, you need to state where the Docker file is. So the context, that is where context. So the current directory slash. So this is where our Docker file, this is the context in which we are building our Docker. Then you specify the Docker file itself. That is the name of the Docker file. Now, you also need to define the image name if you don't want if you don't want Docker to just give your application any name. So the image name, I'll be calling it Laravel. I'll be calling it Laravel 11. I can just call it Laravel 11 image, app image. Let me say app image. So this will give it a nice name so that it will be easy for us to actually identify it. Now, the name of the container name, I'll still be calling it Laravel 11 app. Then you can instruct your container to restart depending on the value. So I'm going to say restart. There are some couple of value. You can say always, or you can say unless stopped, right? So on restart it will only restart except the container itself is stopped. But I like this idea so that I don't necessarily have to actually define a container. I don't necessarily have to restart it unless I've actually stopped it, which is why I'm going with that value. The next thing we need is working directory, where we want this Docker container to be used, right? So var /ww. Remember that we defined the working directory here as well. So we must make sure we copied all our file into this directory. So we must make sure that we actually set the working directory to the file that we actually set in that part. Then the volumes. Volume is basically something that tells you where your files actually exist inside the Docker container. So the volumes, there are two sections to the volume. There is the volume of where in your system, or will I say server, and there is the volume that is inside the container itself. The volume that is inside your system is usually on the right hand side, which this basically means the current directory. And we are referencing this current directory to the /var/ww, which is what is inside our Docker container. The next volume that we need to define, I will not do that yet. Let's leave that for now. So now that we've actually defined our Laravel app service, right? Now that we've defined that, the next thing that we actually need to define is network. So the purpose of network is you can think of Docker network as something that allows containers to actually communicate with each other. So any container that is inside that has the same network or associated to the same network can communicate with each other. Now, in layman language, you can think of Docker container as, okay, you have all these nice gadgets in your house. You have the TV, you have multiple monitors, you have multiple TVs, you have lights, and you need them to be able to communicate with each other, right? You have all these electronics that can connect to the Wi-Fi. So the Wi-Fi is like your network. It is what allows your applications to actually connect with each other. That is, your TV is able to connect to your phone. Your phone is able to connect to your um laptop, or any of those sorts. So that's basically what a Docker container is. So I'm going to define a network, and I'm going to call this network Laravel 11 app network. You can call it anything you like. You can name it anything you like. Anything you like. So I'm just trying to be consistent here. Now that we've actually defined our app network, and this app is basically our PHP service. Remember, all we've built here is the PHP service container, right? So the next thing we need to build is the Nginx service. Nginx. In order to run a PHP application, it's either you are using Nginx or you are using Apache, right? So, but I'll be using Nginx. Now, for the Nginx, I'll be calling it Laravel 11. The name of the service, it will be Laravel 11 web server. The image that we'll be using, you can look for image by just going to Google and say Nginx Docker image. It will take you to the official page, and you see the different version of Nginx that you can actually copy inside. So you can see an image, then it also requires a volume, blah blah blah, and the likes. So all I need to do is, but the image that I'll be using for these Nginx will be Nginx of type appline. That's what I'll be using for this Nginx image. So the next thing that we actually need is the container name, the name of this container. So I'll just be calling it Laravel 11. How did we name it here so that we can Laravel 11 container name. So we can still call it, we can just say, we can say Laravel 11 container web server container. So let me just name it like that. So it will be equal to, when we are inspecting, we will understand. The same thing I'm going to use unless stopped. It should not restart unless it has been stopped. Now, we need to define ports. Now, for ports in Laravel, in Nginx, normally Nginx ports are opened. The default port that is open in Nginx is 80, port 80. For you to actually run any application in Nginx, it has to be opened on port 80. Just like we defined ports in our Dockerfile, we also need to define port for our Nginx. But for the Nginx, we need to define the ports that will be accessible outside, the container. So for accessing this web server, I will be using port 61, let me say 61, 62. And this 6162 is how we are going to access the application. You can think of it as local host, then port 6162. That is how you'll be able to load your Laravel application, 6162. And it will be communicating with the port 80 inside the container. So this is basically inside the container, outside the container. That's basically what we are trying to do there. So that's the port that we actually need for this web server. Then we also need it to make sure that it is on the same network with our PHP application. And what do they call the network name? Networks. So let me just do this. Networks like so. Now, the nice thing here is we can quickly test our application right now, right? We can quickly test it. So let's see if we can actually run. Okay, let me add quotes. You said I should add quotes. No problem. I've given you quotes. So let's see if we can run our application. So to build this application, we need docker compose build. We already have PHP and we have our web server. So why can't we run it? So let me just build it. So you can see app network. Okay, in order for us to be able to build it, remember I said we need to, all the network that we've actually defined, we now need to state it right at the bottom last like this and say the network that we defined, and we actually need to specify the driver for the network. For the driver that I'll be using, I will just be using Bridge. If you want to know more about the kind of drivers that are available, you can check the Docker documentation. So we are going to build. Now, our application is pulling all the necessary Docker stuff that we need, the Docker dependencies that we need. I'm just going to pause, and when it is done, I will come back. So if everything went well, you should be seeing this at the end of running your Docker build. So what we are going to do now is we are going to start our application, Docker Compose, or let's even inspect Docker Compose PS. Okay, we've not started it. The conversion is absolute. Okay, so let's start our application, Docker Compose, compose up. Yeah. So now we've started our application. So you can see Laravel 11 web server container has been started. So based on the ports that we actually defined here, if we go to our web browser now and say localhost 86162 So you can see now our Nginx server is loading. That means our Nginx server is working, but our application is not loading. And I will show you why our application is not loading. So I'm going to stop the Docker container. So there are some couple of other configuration that you must you must implement in order to be able to load your Laravel application. So the first thing I'm going to create is I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call it make directory. Mind you, you can call this folder anything you like. So I'm just going to call it Docker Compose. Now, inside the Docker Compose folder, I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to call the folder PHP. Then inside this folder, I'm going to create a file called local.ini. So this is basically just a configuration. This is not a PHP file. Let me delete this. I want this to be, that will be new. It is just going to be a file, local. I can even call it local.conf because it is our PHP application configuration. Then I'm going to copy the configuration file. That is the configuration file that are related to PHP. So let me rename it to, this is not the actual configuration. Rename to local.ini. Right? So now, if you are seeing this, you understand upload max file size. So by the time you want to actually start doing some stuff in your, maybe you want to upload file, this will help you override the upload max file size inside your PHPFPM image, and it also help you override the post max size, that is the highest number of the size that you can send into your application. So we need another configuration for uh, the Nginx server that we want to actually connect to. So I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call it Nginx, and I'm going to create a file. I'm going to create a file. I'm going to create a file, and I will call it. I'll call it. I'm thinking of a nice name to actually give the file. I'm thinking of the best way to actually name it. So let me just call the file conf d. It's that, not that name. I mean a directory. Sorry. Read. So I'm going to create a directory. Or I can just create the file right here, and I'm going to call it let me say Laravel 11 config, Laravel 11.conf. Basically, I can just do that. So the Laravel 11 conf will contain some file, and the file that it will contain some configuration, which I will actually explain. Now, for those of us that are familiar with setting up interacting with engines, you actually understand the purpose of this file. So the first thing we are doing is we are listening to port 80, and we are defining the file that can be loaded by this server. So what this is, we are doing here is we are defining the default server configuration. So instead of loading this welcome.nginx, it will load the configuration that we've actually defined here. Now, the part that I want you to pay attention to is this app, then the 9000. So our own, it will not be app. It will be, remember we exposed the port 9000. It will remain port 9000, but in our Docker compose file, we called it Laravel 11 app, and we are going to replace it with that. So once we do this, just copy, write this file, and you know that in our Laravel app, our index file is inside the public folder, right? And which is why we are actually attempting to run. We can remove index.html, can remove all of this. We can just leave index. So this will contain our log files, any error that actually occurs within our application, access log, that is the request that is coming into our application, the root where our application is, that is our index.php is, and Laravel 11, basically where or the name of the service of the PHP FPM. So I'm going to now go back to our configuration in our Docker-compose file, and I'm going to copy that Nginx configuration. I'm going to copy that Nginx configuration into our configuration in Nginx itself. So we go to, so what we are going to do now is we are going to access the Docker Compose folder, Docker Compose folder slash where the configuration is Nginx, right? Slash. So our Nginx, so this is laravel.conf, right? So we don't need to want to copy everything that is inside this file into this part of the app or inside our container in slash etc slash Nginx slash conf dot d. So this is where the configuration that we are copying here is going to go into. So let's try to restart the application now and see how that goes. So I'm going to rebuild the application, which is going to be very fast because we already have most of the images in the system. Then we are going to run Docker Compose up. Now let's refresh our application. Now you can see that voila, our application is now loading. The error we are getting now is more of a database issue. So that means our Laravel application is actually now running. And you can see we are accessing it in C6162. Now, let me show you something, guys. Now, let's see our old, I will run, let me keep this Docker Compose up. I'll open another terminal and I'm going to say Docker Compose PS. Now, you can see that we have, this is not clear. It's not very clear. I wish I can show this much better. So basically, we have, this is the name of our Laravel, our PHP application. As you can see, we have the name of the image, just like we defined the name of the image, the name of the service, and so on and so forth. So in order to actually go into the Laravel app, we can say Docker Compose. We want to go into the Laravel app, Docker Compose, execute, like so. I'll now say the name of the Docker container is either you use the name or the Docker container ID. So if you say then slash bin slash bash, I guess. Okay, let's quickly check. Enter Docker container. So this is what we need to actually run. So like so, Docker container ID. I think we can use the name, then bash. Yes. Now you can see we are inside the Docker application now. If you do ls, so you can see all the files that is here has been copied into this application. So as we can see, everything we actually have in our file here is being copied. So all our code, everything is actually inside our Docker container now. So that's the purpose of all the volumes that we've been defining all since we actually started. So I'm going to exit. Now that we have our application running, if we refresh again, refresh, so you can see it is running. So if we come to our env, so if we come to our env and we call it Laravel 11 app and refresh, So you can see the title of our application has actually changed. So that means our changes is actually being loaded. Now, we need a database to actually connect to. The database that we'll be using for this particular application is MySQL. So what we need to do now is define a service for MySQL. So I'm going to call this MySQL service, and I'm going to call the name of this service Laravel 11 11 11 app MySQL. Now, we need an image. So which version of MySQL do we want to use? I won't waste our time. I'm just going to use MySQL version 5.7. So you can see we have different, it's even giving us options. So depending on the one that you want to use, 5.7.122, that's the version I'm going to use. If you want to know more, you can go to MySQL, say MySQL Docker image. Here you will actually find the different version of MySQL version that are actually available and different configurations that you must actually provide, which will still be coming back to. So you see here, all they are just putting here is just MySQL alone, irrespective of. So I can just pull MySQL and that will actually pull the latest MySQL. I'm not sure if I can do latest, but let's try. I'm not sure if that is possible. I'm not sure if that is possible. Let's see if we can actually do that. So yes, we can actually use latest. So you can see there's latest. There's a latest tag that we can use. So let's see if that is actually going to work. So, and if it does not work, we'll just come back to change it to the version that I want to use initially. So we need to give it a container name. By the way, the container name is not necessary. Um, your application, Docker is going to give it a name itself if you don't provide it a name, container name, and I'm going to say restart. I can always say always, or I can even just say restart unless stopped, depending on how you want to actually configure it. Then it needs ports as well. As we know, MySQL port default is 3306. So you need to define the port that you are going to use to actually access it. So the port that we are going to use to access it outside the container, I'll be using 3337. Hopefully I've not used the port in my application. 337, and the container port inside the port inside the container. So let me just quote it. They should be in quotes. So that's the port that we actually need. Then um for volumes, we also need to define volume for our MySQL. But for now, I'm going to intentionally not actually define any volume for now. So now that we've actually defined our database, we've defined our database configuration, we actually still need more. Sorry, we need to define some environment variable. And the purpose of the environment variable is for us to define maybe a default database that is going to be created when we pull the MySQL image. So for example, we can say MySQL, all of these things, you can find them in the documentation. So they are not things that I'm just pulling out from the top of my head. Let me see if I can locate it. So you can see MySQL root password, MySQL database. So this variable is optional, allows you to specify the name of database to be created on image startup. If user password is supplied, then the user will be granted super user access. You can supply MySQL user, you can supply MySQL password. So let me define MySQL password. We are going to call it password. Then that's MySQL root password. We can also call MySQL database. I'm just going to say Laravel 11 DB. Then we can also define the MySQL user. We can define a MySQL user. We can say Laravel 11 user. You can also call MySQL password. So this would be the password for this user, right? So if you can look, these variables are optional, used in conjunction to create a new user and set the user's password. The user will be granted super user permission for the database specified in the MySQL database up here, right? So we can say MySQL user password. We can still call it password. So that will be password as well. So there are other stuff that you can also define. So for now, I think I'm fine with the environment that we've actually defined. We also need to specify the network. We also need to specify the networks. So network that this container can actually connect with, and that's our network as we have been defining, right? Because otherwise, if you don't define this network, it will not be able to actually communicate with other container inside this particular. So I'm going to run docker compose up build to actually pull our MySQL version. So that is going to take okay, that didn't take time. That's nice. So I'm going to run docker compose up, compose up. No, we can't do that. We already have, so I'm going to, okay, it has already exited itself. So this is stopping. Okay, it has stopped. So I'm just going to come back to this terminal, docker compose up. Now our application is up, and our MySQL, as you can see, is also up, right? Ready connection bind. Okay, 3306. So if we refresh our application, you can see that we are still having that issue. So in order for us not to have that issue, what we can do is, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to our environment variable, and I'm going to define the necessary configuration. So this is how you actually connect this MySQL that we've actually created to your Laravel application. So the host will be the name that you've actually defined here. The name you've defined here, you go to your configuration, and you are going to remove this as the host. The port that you are going to connect to is the port that you've defined in this left hand side, 337. You are going to go to your environment variable and assign the ports. Then the database that you've actually defined, we've defined the database, this, we are going to copy it, come to our environment variable, replace it. The username, we have a root user, and we already know that we've defined the root user password. As you can see, MySQL root password as password. We are going to replace it here too. Now, if we refresh our application, let's see what happens. We are saying connection refused to MySQL, select start sessions, blah, blah, blah. So what we are going to do now is let's try to actually run migration. So how do you run migration, right? How do you run migration? The way you are going to run migration is based on the configuration you have actually used. So I'm going to copy the name of the PHP service container, docker compose, execute. Inside this PHP container, the command php artisan migrate. Now, what this will do is it will try to actually communicate with the database. Okay, so let's try to restart our Docker Compose. And then let's go back. So the port should be 127.0.0.1. Now, if we come back here to run PHP artisan migrate, now you can see that our migration is running. But if we want to run it inside the container, that would for 3306 and the name of the service. Yeah, name of the service for the MySQL. They will come here. Let me just, that would be db underscore host equals to this. Now, if we can, we can now run Docker. So what we are now doing now is Docker compose, execute inside the command, inside this application Laravel 11 app, execute PHP artisan migrate. Now, the reason why this migration is not going is because I've done the migration before, or basically because we've done the migration using that Laravel command. If I bring down our app and bring it, let me say down, and let me bring it back up and rerun the migration again. Now, so as you can see now, rerunning the migration again actually runs the app. So the reason why it failed the first time is maybe because our database was not yet ready to actually run. So in order to rectify that, what we are going to set up a way to actually make sure that our Laravel app depends on the Laravel MySQL container itself. So that way, so let me just get into it. So we are going to come to this Laravel app, right? And we are going to state that depends on. So when you say a service depends on another, that means the service that it depends on must have started before this current service actually starts. So I'm just going to say it depends on Laravel 11 MySQL. So this way, Laravel 11 MySQL service must have started before the Laravel 11 app gets started. So we can do the same thing. So we can also tell Nginx that it should depend on this Laravel app. If this Laravel app has not yet been loaded, then the Nginx has no business actually starting. So we are going to go to our engines. We are going to tell it that it depends on the Laravel app, because we actually need our PHP service running before we actually start engines. So I'm going to come back here, and you will notice that MySQL should no longer be the one running last. So I'm going to rebuild the image. Then I'm going to do docker compose up. Now we are sure that our application is actually up. If I come back and run migration, so we can see our migration is still running. Okay, so we can see that our migration is running, and if we come to here also and we change back to want to connect to it externally, so that would be what would be 3337, and we do PHP artisan migrate. So these are the two ways you can actually connect to an MySQL database that you've created inside your container using Docker Compose. So the one thing that we must do is we must know is that when you actually bring down a Docker container, the volumes that are associated to it, that is the data that you might have stored in your database, are lost. And we don't want that. And that is basically the purpose of volume. Every time we restart our container, we want to make sure that our volumes are still present. So let us go ahead and actually attach a volume to our MySQL database. So any data we are saving into it can be saved appropriate. So in order to do that, all we need to do is create a volume tag volume, and the first volume we are going to need, we can call it Laravel 11 DB data. I can even call it MySQL data. You can call it anything that you like, MySQL data, and it is going to reference /var/MySQL slash slash library/MySQL. So once this volume has been attached, another volume that, yeah, for now I think we are good. So if you have any custom configuration that you actually need to attach to your DB, you can also attach it right here using the volume. But this is what I'll be using for now for this particular session. So once you define a volume here, it is necessary for you to now define a volumes tag here, and you call it the name of the volume, and you specify driver. So the driver we'll be using will be local driver. So now that we've actually attached a volume to our application, the next thing we want to do is to actually create a way to be able to access the database, to be able to see the items inside our database, right? So for that, we'll be making use of PHPMyAdmin. So I'm just going to come here and I'm going to say Laravel 11 PHP my admin. Now, every thing we need is the image. So if you come to PHP my admin docker compose to the official image. So you can see there are different versions that are actually available to us. So I'll be making use of the Apache version for this particular session. That will be PHP my admin. The version that we want to use is 5.2.1 Apache. That will be the name of the image we want to put. The container name, that will be, you can just call it this, my admin container. Then how often do we want to restart? We want to restart it unless it is stopped. That's the only time we want to. The ports that you actually want to use to access the PHP my admin. For this, you can use 8383. Hopefully, I'm not already using that port. Let me put the port 8383. Then port 80. So it will be running on port 80 inside the container. So we need to actually specify. So this one will allow us to be able to access it outside of the container. So that will be for the ports. Then the environment, you need to actually set some environment. If we come to the documentation, you can see that there are some environments that we can set. PMOs, define address name, where the MySQL server resides, PMA, the port of the MySQL server, and so on and so forth. Then we have the PMA user and the PMA password. This is basically the username and password we into admin. So to start with, the first thing I'm going to define for the environment variable is PA underscore host. And our PA underscore host will be the name of the Laravel service, because our PHPMyAdmin is inside the container and it will be on the same network with the container. So that will be the host. Our PMA port, which is basically the port of your MySQL, and that will be 3306, right? Because that is the port containers within this particular app can access the MySQL database. Then we have the PMA underscore user. So what do we want to call it? I will just call it root. And the PMA underscore password. For this, I'm just going to call it password. Yeah, that is all we. Then we need to define networks. That is the network this Laravel 11 PHPMyAdmin will be on. So the network it will be on is basically the network that we've been using, the Laravel 11 app network. Yeah, that is it for PHPMyAdmin. So all we need to do now is rebuild our Docker image. Docker compose build. Now, this will actually pull the PHPMyAdmin on Docker image. The reason why it is very fast is because I already have the image in my local machine. So we can run Docker compose up. Now it is trying to, okay, it is just pulling it actually. So let's wait while it pulls it. This shouldn't take much time. So depending on your database, that is what will actually determine how fast this will go. So I'm going to do something. I'm going to tell PHPMyAdmin to actually depend on database. Let's say depends on the Laravel MySQL database. So that way it will not start until the MySQL database has been initialized. So I'm going to rerun it again. So that way we have to be certain that it is running. So now to load our local host application, say local host 8383. Now, voila, we can see our database is actually loading. So now we need to actually create the database. So if we come back here, you can see that our PHPMyAdmin is loaded. Sorry, that is what I meant. And you can see a database is being created automatically, Laravel 11. Oh, sorry, the database that we've actually created, we have the DB this, and this one is when I was trying to do our issue. So if I remove these guys, let me see if I could remove these guys. I'll go to databases, and I'm going to remove these two guys. So just so we can see, since the user that we logged in with does not have access to actual, okay, it can drop schema. Drop it. Now, if we come back here and say PHP artisan migrate. Now, for Laravel 11, it will ask you if you actually want to create the database. Say yes, want to create it. Bam, our database has been created. Now you can see that our database has been created. So this is how you actually Dockerize a Laravel application. This is how you actually attach MySQL database to it. This is how you actually attach PHPMyAdmin in order for you to be able to load whatever you actually want to load. And any service that you actually need, you can also load it to the PHPMyAdmin like this. So let's say, for example, you want to add another service, and the service you want to add is probably, let's say, Redis. We can say Laravel. You just create another service as well, Laravel 11 Redis, right? And you pull the image. For Redis, all you need is Redis, then you can say latest, or we can even put step here, Redis Docker official image. We'll see the available tags. So you see that we have 7.4, blah, 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 but let's use 7.5 out to 0.25. Let me say 7. Let me see the tags correctly. So that would be 7.25, 7.2.5 applying. So we are even getting, which is brilliant. So that's the image, and we specify the container name. You can say Laravel Redis container. Remember, you can call these guys anything you like. Then the next thing you need to actually define is the ports. So the ports that we want to use to access it outside the application is 77379. And the port that we will be using to access it inside the application is the default port. This is the default port for Redis. Normally, that will be 6379. I'll put it in quotes. Then for networks, you also need to make sure that it is on the same network, just as we've been doing. like so. Voila, you've actually added Redis um to your application. So now that we actually have PHPMyAdmin working, um, I want you to note that if you want to load your Laravel app correctly like this, your DB host must be the name of the MySQL service, and the port has to be 3306, and this is because our Laravel app is inside the container. If you are to connect to this Laravel application and the Laravel app is not inside the container, then you have to use 127 as the DB host, and you use that external port that we actually created in our Docker compose file. So that is it, and that will be the end of this session. I hope I've been able to share you and actually show you how to connect to your database and how to Dockerize a Laravel application. Thank you, and please share with your friends, subscribe. If there is anything that you feel like I can improve, please share with me so that I can continue to improve it in the process of creating nice content for you, my fans.